in. Welcome everyone to the first of a series of expert user webinars that we'll be hosting as part of Top Step for the OpenAir user community. Many of you may have been able to make it to the User Summit this year. This is a repeat of that presentation because we did have standing room only, which was nice, but that also meant many people couldn't see it even though they were at the summit. So thank you for signing up and joining us in this presentation, and we look forward to having you join us in the future webinars that will be hosted each month. What we'll be covering today is, this is actually a feature-rich presentation is the way I like to talk about it. Many times people have requirements for invoices, but they're not quite sure what the system can support or what the system can do currently. So you sort of work around things manually. So what I'm going to do is hopefully I'll be able to show you some features that you may not have known about or you knew about but weren't quite sure how to use them. So we'll walk through a number of these features, and we should end with some time at the end of the webinar to be able to answer some questions if you have any. So let's start with actually a basic functionality that comes with OpenAir that a lot of people don't know about is a prefix for your invoice numbering. If you use OpenAir invoicing, the numbers just start consistent, sequentially from 100, 101, whatever you start the invoice numbering with. But what you may not realize is that you can actually put a prefix in front of that invoice number, and that prefix can actually be driven by the customer who owns the invoice. When you're setting up customers in the system, there's actually a form called billing information. That's where you can set payment terms and the currency and such. But there's also a field called Invoice Prefix. And this invoice prefix actually gets applied directly to the OpenAir invoice, and it will actually be sequential according to that prefix number. So companies consider using this prefix for certain company client, maybe a global client that has multiple subsidiaries or multiple projects, and they want to make sure they have a consistent invoice prefix. Other companies use this to identify a regional prefix, maybe something like a European or a country level prefix, so they get sequential numbering for those regions. That's a basic functionality. It comes with everyone's OpenAir system, but there is a more advanced version of that. It's a prefix setting that you can set per project, and what that requires is an internal switch to be activated, which allows you to apply an incremented invoice number. So how does this work? You actually create a custom drop-down field that you put on the project, and the values in that custom drop-down field are the prefixes that you want to leverage for invoices, and it's one prefix per project. Once you set that value on the project, every time you create an invoice against that project, you can then, if this menu looks familiar, this is one of the run-in-action menus that pops up when you do the checkboxes and the gear above the checkboxes in the invoice module. And many of you can see the first 4 items, but the last item, which is apply incremented invoice numbers, is what appears when you activate that internal switch. And what works then is it takes the invoice number that OpenAir has generated as a draft, and it converts it to the next numeric value according to the prefix set up on the project. Now I'm just going to show you the basic prefix setting, which I still call this advanced invoicing, simply because a lot of people aren't leveraging it, and it's something that can be used today without turning on any internal switches. So let me just jump into my sandbox here and show you I did set up a client. I have M&M Wacky World set up, and in the Billing Information tab, you'll see that I put a prefix TSC-. Okay? I just so happen to have run some charges already through the system, so I'm going to go right to the Invoice module, and I'm going to generate an invoice. And you can see, let's take a step back, and you can see what the next numeric invoice number would be. Oops. So I'm at invoice number 460. So technically, if I create another invoice, it would be 461. However, when I go to create my MMWW invoice, and I create the invoice, you'll see that the invoice number is actually not 461. It's a numeric sequence according to the prefix TSC-456, and that would just be the next sequential in that prefix series. Okay? So it allows you to actually apply a specific sequence per region if you're a global company, or per customer if you have customers that have multiple subsidiaries in them. And if I do this M&M, I actually created it, didn't I? Maybe it went to the bottom because it starts with a letter. There you go. So there's the invoice number, and that's the prefix you can use in the system. The custom field approach with the internal switch works in a similar way, but it does require an additional step for you to actually check the boxes and apply that incremented invoice number. So it's a nice option either way if you need to go down to the project level for specifics. So let's move on to another one that many of you may be aware of, but it's a way to actually customize the formatting of expense items on your invoice in OpenAir to be different than the way that your hourly rates and your fixed fee look. This is specifically something that for users of the invoicing module within OpenAir has always been a little bit of a challenge because you want to format it so it doesn't look strange when expenses show up and there's blank in the hours for expenses because there's no such thing as hours. But then when you put expense item, it's blank when you deal with tasks or fees because there's no such thing as an expense item for labor. So OpenAir actually came up with an option where you can actually inset a different layout to handle the expense item specifically. If you don't see this option in your system, this is an internal switch. Simply have to email OpenAir support and ask for the alternate expense item format. So how does this work? You may recognize on the left-hand side here, this picture shows that I'm formatting the different columns that are going to come across in my invoice. So task, description, hours, rate, total, as you can see here. But actually right below that column, I have another drop-down menu that says Invoice Layout for Expense Items. And it actually says something FMT Summary Expenses. And as I show in the description here, the format of those columns are the expense item, the date, and the total. Obviously things that are missing here, which don't make any sense for expenses, are things like hours and rate. Okay? So it allows you to get a subtotal of information for expenses and makes the invoice itself much cleaner. So I'll take the time to go ahead and show you this in the system. So let's go look at a nice robust report here. This invoice, for example. I'll use this invoice as an example later on as well. You can see the format of this this invoice talks about phases and tasks, which of course is the design of this invoice layout, and it's dependent on how you set up the project, the date that the time was delivered, who, rates, and so forth. But below that, you'll see that there's actually a whole different format for the expenses, and it's been rolled up to the different expense items, a customer PO number for reference, as desired by this particular customer, and then dates and totals, and of course you could always change this as you like. So how did I get to this point? Actually, I'm just going to click into here to the invoice layout. And in particular, this invoice is supported by an invoice layout that talks about the customer PO, the hours, the rate, and the total. But below that it says, and then I want a different format for the summary expenses with PO. So I'm just going to jump into that other format. And as I open up the summary expense layout, you'll see that here's the PO number, the date, and the total, and I'm rolling everything up at the expense item level. So what I've done is I've actually taken two invoice layouts and combined them, and OpenAir specifically supports the ability to combine them in such a way that the expense items are reformatted. Okay. Now, with this approach or activating this type of feature, what we like to recommend to our customers is that if you are using an inset expense item, you follow some type of naming convention like FMT, because you know that's really meant to just reflect expenses, and it's really meant to be that inset reformatting piece of the puzzle. Nothing says you can't use this as a primary invoice layout, but usually you've done something, a shortcut, you've left information out because this is really just supposed to be for expenses. So a naming convention helps communicate information effectively this way. And if you're not using it now, you'll definitely have fun turning it on and playing with it to try and get the nicest invoice layout possible. So let's move on to another expense-related layout, and it's something called custom expense item groups. I'm not sure how many people actually have noticed this on the invoice layout, or it may not be showing up at all on your invoice form. It is an internal switch to activate this. But what it allows you to do is group information so that you can display expenses in one basic category. How I see this useful in many accounts is the way that the accounts payable department has consultants submit expenses. Many times there's various types of meals. Sometimes it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, client meal, entertainment meal, business meal, internal meal, and you end up having to categorize it to support the accounts payable and the accounting transaction tracking for cost to the company, which is fine, but anything that gets rebilled to the customer does not necessarily need to see breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Of course, there are always exceptions, but what they just want to know is how much money did you spend on meals. And the expense group is a great way to sort of reflect the general category of where the expenses were coming from. So in the example that I was just talking about, you would actually create an expense item called meal, and you would add those individual pieces, internal, dinner, breakfast, lunch, snack, coffee, whatever the categories are that you're tracking. And that way what it will do is it will actually show up on the invoice in the category of meal and meal only with no other details. So actually in this screenshot, I used the same invoice that I used in the previous example. And you can see here I had all these different categories except meals consolidated into the word travel. So I took airfare, lodging, ground transportation, and parking and grouped them all as a concept of travel here. And then when I displayed this on the invoice, it actually rolled all of these categories up into one piece. Okay, and then I left other, like the meal, as separate. So how do I set this up in the system? Again, let's go into an invoice layout, and you can see what I'm talking about as far as how to set this up. With many features, there are some dependencies you have to make sure you're aware of. So let's do like the summary expense format. And as I scroll down the form here, which is the invoice layout form, I come to the section Create Expense Item Groups. When I click on that Create, one thing that you have to be aware of is you have to have at least 2 items in a group. So what this feature does not support is a nice way to rename something, for example. So you can't just call it, flights, add airfare, and then be done. Okay, you can't rename airfare. What you have to do is you have to put more than one expense item in there to create a group, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk about transportation. And in transportation, I would put airfare, ground transit, and train, for example. Okay, and then as I save that, every invoice I have with airfare or ground transit or train, it would actually replace those values with transportation. And as many of you do for your invoices, you roll up by expense item So transportation would now be considered an expense item, and it would just display one value on the invoice. Okay. So retainers. Many of you may have turned this off, or you may not even realize what this tab does if you see it. And what it is it supports the ability to record a prepayment that you received from a customer, and you want to be able to apply that to invoices as you're issuing them to the customer, so that the customer can see the effort that you've performed and then how much you've drawn down against their prepayment, for example. Now, the retainer is in the invoice module, and when you create the retainer, you get a very limited number of fields. You get the client that you can put it against, the date that you created the retainer, for example, or whenever they issued the payment. How much is that payment? And of course, if you have multi-currency on, what currency is it based in? Okay. Of course, with almost every form in OpenAir, there's a notes field. I like to make sure I keep track of things nicely. I add a note, explains what it is that the payment was for. Okay, and I save it. Now that the retainer is in there, what good does it do me? What it actually allows you to do is, as you generate invoices for this client, the system will automatically pop up at the total of the invoice to say, how much would you like to draw against the retainer? The current balance is this. Okay? And it allows you to actually just apply the retainer without having to look anything up to understand, what the current balance is. It helps you out in that capacity. So let me actually show you a retainer approach that I've used in the past. So if I go back to all of my invoices, and I'll go to my Pellegrino customer. If I open up one of these invoices, this is a normal invoice where I invoiced the customer. They did pay it, so they have a balance of 0. But at one point, they actually commissioned some advanced work, and that advanced work was then entered in as a retainer in the system. And here you can see Pellegrino asked just to cover a couple of hours worth of work and how much information I wanted to keep. So as I worked off that activity, you can see that one of the last invoices I sent the customer, I only ended up working, this person only ended up working a half an hour, which generated $50 worth of charges. And as I was generating the invoice, the retainer came up saying, how much would you like to draw against the retainer? And in this case, I had enough to cover the entire invoice. Therefore, I could send this to the customer to say, you don't owe me anything, but I've burned this much more against the amount that you've paid me. Okay? So retainers are nice to use. They're sort of like a customer POs. So a lot of times I'll get the question of, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between a customer PO versus a retainer as far as functionality and when to use it in OpenAir? So the main difference between the customer PO and the retainer is the customer PO, when the customer issues that purchase order for you, it's an expectation that they will pay. So this is a way for them to maintain budget on their side, but they still hold the money. And every time you invoice them, you can invoice them against their customer PO so that they know where to pull the budget money from to send you payment. Retainers are almost the opposite. Although they track a balance, retainers mean the customer has gone ahead and given you money, and now you own this money, and you need to earn it, basically. And for many of you, that means you can't recognize that as revenue until you've delivered services against that prepayment. So the retainer allows you to demonstrate and show to the customer, I have delivered this much of your services, therefore I'm taking this much out of your retainer, your balance is this. And so they are able to see how much work is being performed and also be able to make sure they understand what their balance is as well. Okay? But the main difference is who owns the money and how the tracking is done. Okay. Within a customer PO and a retainer, I will tell you that both of these are at the customer level. With customer POs, because it's a commitment to pay. We'll talk about those a little bit later in the presentation, but you can attach those down to the individual billing rule level within projects and have it reflect on the invoice. However, with the retainer, it's at the customer level. It's not associated with any billing rules. It's not associated with any projects. So it's really something that you have to control and use as you generate invoices and know which invoices to apply the retainer on. So that's the one drawback. So we've talked about numbering and we've talked about formatting a bit with the expense stuff and the retainer functionality, which actually comes with OpenAir. You just may not have found a good way to use it or why to use it. So let me actually take a further deep dive into the actual invoice form itself and some of the things that you may not know that it can do because you got some initial sample layouts when you deployed the system, haven't really played with the form too much. The way they look is good enough. Let's go forward. So one of the first things that people may not be aware of is invoice terminology. So obviously OpenAir has a terminology that they apply to the invoices, bill to, ship to, total, hours, date, just your typical words. But I find a lot of times when we get down into tax locations, people want to call it something special. Instead of GST, they want to call it VAT, or they want to rename something instead of hours to be, effort along the way. So. Okay. What will end up happening is people, they want to change the terminology on the invoice. There is actually an internal switch that says Customize Invoice Terminology. And what that allows you to do is it gives you every single value, like name, that would show up as a header or a title in the invoice. And you can imagine it's a pretty long list because if you look at any invoice, there's the term invoice, to, from, type, date, user, hours, rate, expense item, adjusted total, total, subtotal. All those would show up as items that you can override. But the bigger benefit for those minor tweaks you want to do is for those of you who have to send invoices perhaps in another language. So the English terminology is not sufficient or not desired by your client base. This is how, with this invoice terminology override, you can translate the standard words on an OpenAir invoice into, Dutch and German and Spanish and whatever language you want, so by simply typing in what it should say on the invoice itself. Now, the rest of the information on the invoice, of course, would then just have to be in that language based on the way you entered the data into the system, such as a person's name or the company name or the word hourly. Actually, hourly is something you can override already. But this is how you basically translate invoices into a foreign language, is by using this customized invoice terminology. So if you've struggled with that, or if you're downloading stuff manually into HTML and you're typing over top of it, check it out. See if you can turn that feature on. Turning it on does not impact anything, but it does give you something to play with, and you can always create new layouts and play with that invoice terminology to see if it'll be something that works for you. The next one that some of you may already realize is there is it's actually a standard field for the invoice title, and what do I mean by that? By default, the invoices generated from OpenAir don't have a title. Okay, so like if I did a PDF version of this, okay, it's an invoice. I know it's an invoice, but I can actually apply a title to it. And I happen to know it's using this. And again, scrolling down on this form, the invoice title is a field that can be added. So if I want to say this is invoice as the title of the invoice, I can save this. Go back to my invoice. Take a look at it, and you'll see it doesn't show up here, but it will show up when you do the PDF version. Invoice. Okay. Now, you probably don't want to add the value of invoice in there, but what I do see used quite often, and you'll see it's even captured by OpenAir in the notes area, is people will specifically add credit memo as a title, so it's very clear to any customer or to anyone in accounts payable that may be receiving the OpenAir version of the invoice that it is a credit and not an actual invoice. Okay, so feel free to play with that on your layout. And also, as I was showing you the invoice, I was applying the Top Step logo. The Top Step logo is getting applied because of the way that the logos have been set up in your system. You know, they show up on your page usually as you're working through OpenAir, shows up on a lot of your printouts, and also shows up on your invoice. But for some of you, it may be beneficial for you to change that logo. Maybe different customers, you have a multi-subsidiary company, so you want to actually send the invoice with a different logo on it. In that case, what you can do is you can actually upload a different logo specifically to a certain invoice layout. Here's where naming convention is really going to be important. I would definitely make sure you call the invoice layout, you know, it's the consulting subsidiary versus the development subsidiary. And that allows you to apply a different company logo if you are supporting multiple organization branding within your company. And that way you can customize your invoices so you can send many different types of invoices out under the different logo and branding views. And likewise, I've seen many, many cases, and I'm sure you have, when you get some invoices from vendors, you see that there's usually a standard wording at the bottom, or, you know, please remit with this, you know, address or this account number or something on it. Maybe instructions on how to send stuff to the bank directly with direct deposit. Those can all be standard words that you capture in like a JPEG, a GIF, a PNG format, any like a picture format, and just apply it as a picture onto the invoice. And what that allows you to do is just give a little bit more information that's standard as part of the format of your invoice. And I've done that in one of these cases here. And if I look at the HTML version, you'll see here when they look at the soft copy of the invoice, please remit all payments to Top Step Consulting. That actually is a PNG format file that I cut and pasted off of, you know, a picture that I had. Now, some of the other display options that you can consider in the system, recently this year they actually came out with some changes on how to deal with sorting. The sorting was fairly limited. I know many of you probably have benefited from this sorting option or may not realize it's there. But what you can do now is you can actually force the sorting to happen in a certain way, alphabetically, by date, by numbers, whatever the primary and secondary sort you select, it will sort the information on the invoice in that manner, and it makes it a little cleaner for many invoice layouts. Now, the thing I do caution people on is, as we were looking at this feature, the number of options that you have to filter or to sort on is quite long. In fact, if I go and look at an invoice layout, if I just pick this primary charge sort, boy, look at this long list of what I can sort by. I can sort by values, highest to lowest, lowest to highest, custom fields that I have in the system, people, job codes, all kinds of things. Okay, but one thing that I can see is phase ID, which as a project manager at heart, I always look forward to sequential numbers on my phases and my work breakdown structure along with tasks, for example, so a task ID. Okay. Now, with the primary charge sort of phase ID and task ID, to a project manager this would be very logical. The challenge is, however, that phase ID is not currently a value that you can display on the invoice. Okay? You can display the phase, but not the phase ID. So as you're probably already jumping to the conclusion of, if you sorted by phase ID and by some happenstance the phase IDs are not in the order that you would expect, things may look a little random on your invoice. So I just caution people to make sure that if you are sorting by something behind the scenes, that you may want to consider making sure it's visible on the invoice so that you can double check to make sure the sorting is right and it looks logical. Okay. There's also something, it's a page numbering. Page numbering is available for your invoices for those of you who have multi-page invoices that you have to deal with in OpenAir. These are unfortunately all internal switches. All you have to do is email OpenAir support. And you can ask for the page numbering to be displayed. You can have it be displayed in PDF only, or you can actually put it in the PDF when you combine invoices. What that means is, that run in action where you can say just download all these invoices into one PDF. You can actually have the page numbering be honored as you download all those invoices at the same time. Okay. Some other things, customer addresses. Now, when I work with customers that are using invoicing in OpenAir, there's always the desire to sort of move entire sections around or change where the address shows up. And there's obviously limitations to that. The OpenAir format for invoices is a basic header, address section, then the body, which is where you can do a lot of customization. But in the address section, by default, and typically the standard layout has a build to and then a from section. Okay? But if you start adding other contact types in your system, you can, besides build to, you can add ship to. And actually sold to is also available as a contact. You do have to turn that on as an internal switch so that you can track those 3 types of contacts. And what does that mean to track 3 types? What happens is when you create a contact, right now many of you see just the checkbox that says can be a billing contact. Right? So when you have ship to and sold to turned on, then you also see can be a ship to contact, can be a sold to contact. So as you check those boxes off, and I'll jump into the system to kind of explain it as I go along. As you check those boxes off, those different contacts become available to set on the project level. So I'll just pick a random person here. And here's that can be a billing contact. So you can also see things that can be a sold to contact, can be a shipping contact. So now if I go into a customer, for example, and I pick a project, here's the project form. Many of you are probably familiar with this. And the project form actually will show who the base billing contact can be. Oh, I don't have one defined for this customer. Sorry. Okay. So under the invoice layout field, if you have defined billing contacts, you can pick the billing contact from your list of people. Okay? If you have shipped to and sold to checkboxes as well, and you've indicated this customer has shipped to and sold to, those also show up as additional drop-down fields here. So you'll have shipping contact and sold to contact. So great. I set all these contacts. What does that buy me? Okay? What that actually buys you is on the invoice itself, you then can actually, let's go to an invoice. On the invoice itself, instead of just saying from build to and then from, you can put build to, ship to, sold to, and then from. So you can add all levels of contact information to the actual address line itself. So if you thought you had some limitations there, you actually don't. You can expand the number of addresses on the invoice with no problem. There is a little-known feature also called a custom header. And what is a custom header? Actually, it's not necessarily a header, but it's more of an invoice note that is preset with a certain wording in it. And that preset wording can then be updated directly with real-time information. The specific instance of where this custom header, how it came to be and how it's being used today is putting a standard wording on your invoice that says services delivered between this date and this date, for example. Okay? And that custom header ends up being an internal switch that you can define the wording to be displayed on the invoice, and then the dates are substituted when you go to create the invoices. Specifically, when you create multiple invoices, you can give a date range. That date range is then substituted in. It's a little known feature. It's not used widely anymore, but if you have a need for some kind of standard sentence where you're always sort of typing things manually on the invoice, I would definitely look into this a little bit more. It is meant to show a sentence that has a start and end date value in it, and it's something that you can leverage in the system and use with multiple invoices. Billing codes. I think I talk about this almost every time I talk about features that are little used. Billing codes are actually, it's the field that's on the project form that a lot of people just ignore because they don't know what it's used for. It's not a drop-down, it's just a blank 2-character box. And now with form permissions, a lot of people just hide it because they don't see the value in it. So what is a billing code? A billing code is a self-defined up to 2-character item where you can tag a project as a certain type of invoicing pattern. And why am I saying it that way? It's meant to be something completely definable by your organization and your needs. In the example I have here, I worked with a customer where they decided their contracts, they have different invoicing schedules based on the type of contract signed. They have monthly invoices, semi-monthly invoices, quarterly invoices, and so forth and so on. You can imagine it's a bit difficult to kind of keep track of when I run invoices this Friday. Is this just the monthly invoices, the mid-month invoices, the quarter invoices? Like, what invoices am I running? Because for those of you who are actually using the invoicing function in OpenAir and running the billing, you don't necessarily see that unless you're setting up some kind of custom field on the project. My option is, instead of setting up a custom field, you can actually use the billing code. And what this customer did was they actually set up billing codes to help them tag projects to see how frequent the invoicing should be. Okay, so customers that needed to get an invoice semi-monthly, whenever they ran billing, this Friday is the semi-monthly monthly invoices. I would run billing codes SM and M, and only projects that have those billing codes on it would show up in my billing report, and therefore I could generate those invoices without any headaches. Okay. Other customers I've seen use this feature have done it based on special activity required for the invoices. Things like, I need to convert this invoice from an actual expenses to a per diem expense view, which is always a manual interaction. I need to split the travel on this invoice. I need to split travel and fees on 2 separate invoices. So when I go to generate the invoice, if I run it based on travel split or TS or whatever you call that billing code, I know any invoices generated from that batch need to have one extra step because I need to separate those out. So you can use billing code for whatever you need. That's part of the problem why I don't think it's used very often, is because it is completely a blank slate and you have to define it. So let me show you, I did set up a project, a couple projects in the system. I'll show you in this report here. So I just wrote a report real quick to show you projects that I have in my system, and you'll see that just these 2 projects have what's called an M billing code because I'm going to call those my monthly invoices. Now, if you don't know, when you run billing, you can run it across all your projects at the same time by clicking on Pending Billings. Now, one thing you may have recently known, OpenAir added this billing code filter, but I'm going to leave this blank for now, as many of you do, and run the report. And what happens, here's a series of projects that are coming up that are ready to be invoiced. Okay? But what if I only want to run the ones that have monthly? It's time for my monthly invoices. I don't want to run anything else. Well, let's go back to that report. I actually had entered a billing code of M to indicate monthly projects. So now what happens when I run this report? You'll notice that I had 2 projects on that report that were tagged as monthly. So now when I run this, without changing anything else, simply by applying the billing code, I've only paid attention to those 2 report projects because those were the 2 that I needed to generate invoices for. And then I would proceed on with my normal activities, create the charges, create the invoices, and I've done my monthly billing, so to speak. Okay? So that's how billing codes actually can help you quite a bit. Likewise, if you've run all of your invoices but you really just want to format or batch items up according to, I'll just go ahead and create these. If you want to batch your monthly invoices, for example, let's say you create a whole bunch of billings but you just want to format the 2 monthly ones. If I create new monthly multiple invoices, you've seen this form, but you probably have just skipped over this billing codes field quite often. Okay? And when I run this, you'll see it actually wants to generate 5 different invoices because I just happen to have stuff sitting out there. But what if I redo this, except I only want to format or create invoices for my monthly projects? So again, I'll use that monthly billing code, and you guessed it, the only projects that should be coming up to get invoices are my 2 monthly projects. So it's a nice way to sort of create a filter without having to do too much customization in the system. Customer POs and agreements. This is a functionality. Many people are using the customer POs, maybe not so much the agreements. It's more of a statement of work or a expected plan of effort or cost. But the customer PO functionality in OpenAir allows you to basically create that commitment from the customer saying, I will pay you a certain amount of money based on this engagement. And many customers, especially in the European area, do issue customer POs as part of normal business practice. So great, you enter a customer PO in the system. What else can you do with it? Okay, well, OpenAir actually has standard functionality that allows you to apply this customer PO to any of the customer projects, one or many. And then you can actually identify that customer PO as part of an invoicing activity. So number one, it can keep track of the balance of what you've invoiced to the customer versus what they agreed to pay. And 2, it can also display that customer PO on the invoice itself, which would expedite the whole payment activity, ideally, from the customer. For those of you who are not using customer POs, you may find yourself just typing in a note that says, and this is against customer PO XYZ. And in many cases, I find people are doing that, and someone is keeping track of a spreadsheet that has what POs are funding what projects. Just realize that OpenAir actually has a really robust way to track multiple POs to a single project, multiple projects to a single PO, and trace it all the way through to the invoicing activity, and just let the system figure out the spaghetti on the other end, because you won't have to use that spreadsheet approach anymore for your customer POs.
Oh, good. How'd it go?
So that covers some of the topics that hopefully you've learned at least one new thing from this presentation on the advanced invoicing. It did focus mostly on features and functionalities that you can leverage within the OpenAir system, some standards, some internal switches. But this is the type of information that we will be presenting in our expert user series monthly. So far it's planned, depending on demand. We may have to do it more often. But feel free to take a look at our website. We'll be announcing our schedule shortly. You can find us at topstepconsulting.com. And actually this week we started our Wednesday weekly wisdom tips. Take a look what's out there right now, and it's actually about how to send reports from OpenAir to contacts who are not OpenAir users. Nice time-saving, cost-saving activity for everyone here. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in the presentation, and I'll actually open it up to questions at this point if anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
Bye.